Hi friends, Father Kerry here, and this is another Holy Spirit moment, this one with a few reflections on the culture of suspicion in which you and I seem to dwell these days, and what we might do to wean ourselves away from it. A very recent Pew survey affirmed what you and I intuit, that we in this nation are beset by a malaise of suspicion, that no one trusts anyone. Trust in government institutions, trust in science, and trust in the media are way down. Interpersonal trust, particularly when it comes to political differences, likewise way down. Trust in so-called experts, in the elites, especially when it comes to science, way down. Less than a third of the population, for example, says that it has any trust in the CDC, in the government's ability and expertise in diagnosing and treating illnesses. Even more astounding, at least to me, is this particular datum from that survey. Only 28% of respondents claimed that they had trust in the church or institutional religion. What that indicates is that even people who consider themselves to be churchgoers lack trust in the institution to which they belong. Now, there's any number of reasons, of course, for this malaise of suspicion, this malaise of distrust, which you and I are drowning in these days. The rise of social media clearly has something to do with it. In the case of the church, the recent clergy scandals clearly has something to do with it. But I want to suggest to you that there's also been a trickle-down effect from three thinkers that were identified by the 20th century philosopher and theologian Paul Ricoeur. He called these three thinkers the masters of suspicion. And even though it may be the case that many people who today are full of suspicion and distrust have never read these three thinkers, or perhaps have not even heard of them, I believe that their influence has been felt in the general ethos in which we dwell. The three masters of suspicion that Ricoeur identifies are Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, Karl Marx, the German philosopher, and Sigmund Freud, the Austrian psychologist. Each one of these three men, according to Ricoeur, and I think he's absolutely right about this as a matter of fact, insisted that you and I, for the most part, labor under false consciousness. That is, we think that when we come up with opinions and ideas and beliefs, we're arriving at them freely and objectively and rationally, but in point of fact, according to these three masters of suspicion, we are not. Karl Marx, for instance, says that all of our thinking is irremediably tainted by ideological influences. That is, by what the people who are in power economically and politically want us to think. They control what we think by controlling, for example, the media. Friedrich Nietzsche said that there is no such thing as truth, that everything that we call truth is nothing but an army of metaphor and similes, that all we have are various perspectives. Nietzsche seems to be a radical relativist. And Sigmund Freud, of course, said that we can't trust our rational thoughts because they are always infected to one degree or another by our unconscious drives and instincts. So we have to always, these three masters of suspicion insist, we have to always be suspicious of anything that we read or hear or indeed even say, because there's always an hidden agenda at work, ideology or the false insistence that truth actually exists or the unconscious. When it comes to religious belief, these three masters of suspicion have had a particularly strong influence. So, for example, Karl Marx famously says that religion is the opiate of the masses, that in point of fact we are being tricked by the people who are in charge of the society in which we live into believing all of this religious gobbledygook. And we are tricked into believing it because the people in power think that it will keep us in check, that it will control us. Friedrich Nietzsche wants to argue that religious belief in general and Christianity in particular is nothing more than a network of lies with which we deceive ourselves. In fact, he wants to argue that Christianity is a slave religion and a slave morality, accepted by people who simply don't have the strength of will to assert themselves and to recognize that there is no truth. Sigmund Freud insists in a little book entitled The Future of an Illusion that Christianity in particular and religion in general is nothing more than an infantile obsessive neurosis. Only a child will cling to wishful thinking such as a belief in God. It is obsessive because we won't let go of it. And it's neurotic because it's an example of confusing what we want to be real with what really is real. So, these three masters of suspicion's influence, I think, as I said earlier, has trickled down to the general public, such that we now distrust everything. Our default position in our society is suspicion. There's got to be a hidden agenda in what you're trying to tell me. You've got to be trying to manipulate me in some way. And so my immediate response to what you have to say is going to be an adversarial one. Paul Ricoeur calls this way of interpreting the world a hermeneutic of suspicion. Don't get thrown by the fancy word hermeneutic. It simply refers to the lens through which we read reality, our interpretive lens. He offers as a counterbalance to it what he calls the hermeneutics of recollection. It's been called by many different names by different authors and thinkers. Some will call it the hermeneutic of charity, others the hermeneutic of magnanimity, some will call it the hermeneutics of generosity, the hermeneutics of compassion, but let's stick with Ricoeur's term. Let's be loyal to what he has to say, the hermeneutics of recollection. Now, what do we mean by that? Ricoeur wants to argue that if we really want to examine any subject, but especially religion, what we have to do first is to recognize that we ought not to fall into the trap of what's known as the genetic fallacy. It is an informal logical fallacy. The genetic fallacy confuses the origin of a belief with the content of a belief. So, for example, were I to say to you, well, Betty Friedan, of course she's a feminist. She's a woman. What else would she be? And therefore she's biased. I would be invoking the genetic fallacy. I would be looking at the origin of Betty Friedan's feminist philosophy rather than its content. And that surely is not only a logical mistake, but it's egregiously unfair. So what we ought not to do is to go straight for what we think are the motives of people who are trying to tell us something about religion or anything else. What we ought to do is to examine the content of what it is that they're trying to tell us. The content is what Ricoeur calls the object. We ought to focus upon the object of religion rather than questioning the motives of those who try to tell us something about religion. That's the first thing that a hermeneutic of recollection needs to keep in mind. The second thing is this. It's perfectly permissible, and in fact it's obligatory, to analyze religious statements. We want to look at them in their historical context. We want to see if they're consistent or coherent. We want to apply the same tools to a religious text or a religious speech that we apply to any text or any speech. That means that we have to be analytical to a large extent so that we can separate, if you will, the wheat from the chaff. That is what Paul Ricoeur calls decontextualization. But after that, what we don't want to do is to simply say, and there you go, we've shown that it's unreliable. No, what we want to do is to engage then in a process of what he calls recontextualization. We want to see what it is in the text that speaks to us today in our own context. Look it. Unless we assume that everybody who came before us was just either stupid or gullible or wicked, we have to ask ourselves why they took these religious texts as seriously as they did. We recognize that some things in these religious texts are outdated, are antiquated, but we also ought to take seriously the possibility, at least, that there is a nugget of truth embedded in them, which, if we can bring it into our own time and place, will mean something to us and will point beyond itself to what Ricoeur calls the sacred. To recollect, to remember, to retrieve, to recognize with appreciation and gratitude, but with an analytical eye, is the key to a hermeneutic of recollection that will move us away from a hermeneutic of suspicion, that will help to wean us away from the masters of suspicion. And if we can do that with religious texts, then perhaps we can begin to do it with other texts as well, whether written or spoken, with political text, with social text, with moral texts. Now, one more thing, if I may. When we recontextualize a religious text, when we recollect that it just may have something worth telling us, after we've stripped away all of the chaff, we read it in a mode that Ricoeur calls the second naivete. I think this is a really important and interesting claim that he's making. A child reads a religious text with a certain degree of naivete. The child reads the religious text, for example, literally. If the text says that Jonah, the prophet, was swallowed by a whale and lived in the whale of the belly for 3 days, then by gum, that's exactly what happened, according to a naive reading of that particular story. Now, once we have decontextualized and recontextualized a sacred text, chances are good that you and I can no longer believe that literally. Once we bring the story into our own time and place and make it relevant to our own 21st century context, that kind of a story just can't be believed plausibly. So, what do? We recontextualize it. We read it with a critical but faithful eye. And that's what Ricoeur calls the second naivete. We look for, with innocent eyes as it were, the core of truth embedded in that Jonah story, the core of truth that is in the object that we're examining. We don't look for the motivations of the author of the book of Jonah, as if we could find out what the motivations were. We don't worry about whether or not a power position person is going to try and use the story to manipulate us. We don't worry about whether or not it is an expression of wishful thinking, of infantile obsessive neurosis. All of those may be relevant, but they don't speak to whether or not the story is able to impact us in such a way that it brings us closer to that for which we long, a sense of the sacred. What a different culture we would live in, my friends, if somehow we could escape the malaise of suspicion and distrust that seems to have overwhelmed us. So as we enter into a new year, and soon enter into a new presidency of these United States, my hope is that all of us can pause, can recollect, and can appreciate the object of our investigations and inquiry, rather than assuming that there is always a hidden agenda and a desire to manipulate, to deceive, and to control. I'm Father Kerry, wishing each and every one of you a joyous and fruitful new year. Thanks for watching. As always, if you choose, I invite you to subscribe to Holy Spirit Moments, and I will see you again soon. Thanks a lot. God bless.